The UFC 284 main event isn't a regular title fight. In fact, we'd go as far as to say that isn't even a regular super fight. Very seldom in UFC history we have watched two undeniable pound-for-pound greats collide in a matchup of this scale. But on February 12th, UFC 284 will bring us a collision as good as anything you will see throughout this entire decade. But let's take a backstep for a moment. What happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? We all know that styles make fights, and in the pairing of UFC featherweight champion Alexander Volkanovski and UFC lightweight champion Islam Makhachev, we have a pairing that may well be even better in practice than it is on paper. Both men have fully earned their spot amongst the top 5 pound-for-pound fighters in the sport, and each has worked up a certain unbeatable aura about them in recent times. For Makhachev, his status as the premier fighting talent of the current-day Dagestani wave isn't just a product of hype or purely down to the UFC's promotional machine. No, this man's journey from his earliest days to now has forged him into the fighter he is today. You don't need to be an expert to understand that these Dagestani-born athletes are made of something a little different, hardened by the conditions of their upbringing. Iron sharpens iron, and when you had the benefit of learning your craft under the great Abdulmanap Nurmagomedov and later his son Khabib, you're not exactly playing with a fair hand. Islam's rise to UFC lightweight champion has seen him answer question after question, proving his doubters wrong on more than one occasion to eventually capture 155-pound gold with a dominant win over Charles Oliveira. And while sure, even now he hasn't been forced to deal with the same in-octagon adversity that his opponent Volkanovski has, Makhachev's entire life's work is a testament to the hurdles he has been forced to overcome. A close friend of Khabib's from his earliest years, Makhachev worked silently in the shadow of the eagle for years before his path was clear. During that time, he was dismissed by some as a lesser version of Nurmagomedov, a pale imitation that would be lucky to achieve even a fraction of what his training partner was able to carve out of himself. And in his second UFC outing, back at UFC 192, his doubters were giving fuel to feed their fires as Islam suffered a rough TKO loss in the first round to Adriano Martins. A rapid but unquestionably legitimate setback that well and truly killed some of the momentum behind him. But Makhachev, upon reaching this crossroads, handled this adversity as well as possibly. Understanding that he was still 24 years old, he took the necessary time to work on his overall game, fine-tuning some of its weaker parts before returning a year later, embarking on the run of form that would eventually lead him directly to Charles Oliveira. And even then, 10 victories later, people doubted him, begged him to crumble under the pressure of being faced with a fighter as undeniably dangerous as Do Bronx. But in there with the Brazilian lightweight champion, you could not have asked for a more composed, confident, and totally clinical performance from Makhachev. Again, this guy's mental toughness is just on another level, surpassing even the great Oliveira, who many had constantly praised for his ability to overcome his prior reputation as someone who could be broken. And instantly, as soon as Makhachev had that gold belt around his waist, it became clear that many fans had done an almighty U-turn on his prospects. All of a sudden, the question wasn't about Islam's greatness or how far away from Khabib he was. Instead, most fans were left wondering who the hell was going to be able to give this guy a remotely competitive fight. Well, for some of us, the answer to that question could well be the rising featherweight king Alexander Volkanovski. His perfect run in the UFC wasn't met with the type of immediate respect and awe that you might have expected. No, Volk was forced to very quietly carve out his reputation as the dark horse of the featherweight division, beating contender after contender before scoring a trio of victories back to back against Chad Mendes, Jose Aldo, and Max Holloway. But even then, even after Volk repeated the feat in a rematch with Holloway, the fans were not entirely sold. It took an inhuman display of willpower and grit in the T-Mobile Arena last year against Brian Ortega to truly make this man's prowess accepted by the masses. In that fight, Volkanovski was able to put a striking clinic on the hard-nosed T-City, outworking him, outpointing him, and putting an all-round beating on him in a display that rivaled Max Holloway's own legendary performance against Ortega 3 years prior. But there was a moment in that fight that really saw public opinion flip. Ortega is a man who is known primarily for his insanely fast and crafty submissions. Sure, his toughness and physicality for the weight class deserve to be mentioned too, but when you think of T-City, it's his rapid ability to clamp onto necks that springs to mind. And in the third round in there with Volkanovski, Ortega found himself with the opportunity of a lifetime. After catching a stray kick from the champ, he managed to knock the off-balanced Volkanovski to the ground, immediately locking up a lightning-fast guillotine choke in the process. Seriously, the speed of Ortega's choke setups is truly something to behold, and it goes without saying that 99.9% of fighters would have tapped under these circumstances. But just like Islam Makhachev, Alexander Volkanovski is very much a part of that special 0.01%, a true once-in-a-generation talent for a weight class. And despite the fact that one of the finest submission artists in featherweight history had him exactly where he wanted him, Volk survived, using whatever tiny amount of space he could carve out to remain conscious. From there, he wildly flailed his legs trying to break free, and lo and behold, he eventually did. And that's what makes this fight between Islam Makhachev and Alexander Volkanovski so damn intriguing. Both of these guys are truly of that one-in-a-million quality. Both have risen to the top of their division with finesse and true grit in equal measures. And while both men have been able to break the will of many of their recent opponents, when the octagon doors close on February 11, you really do get the sense that anything can happen. In the end, while the striking advantage will go to Volkanovski and the wrestling and grappling will go to Makhachev, it seems likely that we're going to see a battle that goes far beyond the limitations of a simple striker versus grappler matchup. No, this is a content of wills, making the overarching question here, who wants it more? It's a very rare occurrence in MMA for the pound-for-pound number 1 to go against the pound-for-pound number 2, and even rarer for it to take place in a super fight like this one. And though Makhachev is quite new to the pound-for-pound top 15, his position at the very peak of the sport feels well earned, justified by the dominance he has shown so far in his career. The stakes to this fight are truly massive. For Islam, a victory here would give him a feather in his cap that could well prove to be a greater victory on paper than anything his mentor Khabib ever accomplished. That may sound like a stretch, but for as great as the Eagle was, his best wins, that trio of victories over Dustin Poirier, Justin Gaethje, and Conor McGregor didn't come against a fighter as critically lauded as Alexander Volkanovski. Even if Makhachev doesn't rise above Nurmagomedov in your book just yet, you do have to admit that beating Volkanovski would be one hell of a statement. Quite possibly the best win that any fighter can achieve in the UFC right now, except for perhaps a win over Jon Jones. Sure, the size difference will be pointed to, but let's not forget that Volkanovski has experience competing as high as welterweight, and within the 145-pound division, it's a pretty fair to say that he is among the most physically dominant forces we have ever seen. For him, a victory over Makhachev isn't just an opportunity to earn a place among the very few double champs in UFC history. It would be a win that puts his status as one of the era's greatest talents beyond any question. In fact, depending on how the matchup plays out, a win for Volkanovski over a fighter of Islam's caliber up a division could well open a very different discussion about his place among the all-time greats. Both men have a route to victory, and each has the necessary talent to really stifle the other. But when you have the pound-for-pound number 1 and 2 squaring off like this, the differences between could well be minimal on fight night. And for that reason, we believe that this matchup will boil down to a battle of wills, a fight that will give us a concrete answer as to who of the two wants to take this next step into another stratosphere of greatness. Both guys are fighting for much more than a W on the record of UFC 284, and though we'll likely see these two fighting at the top of the sport for at least a few more years, look to this fight as a major indicator of who will be the modern era's answer to the George St. Pierre's, Jon Joneses, and Anderson Silvas of the game. Simply put, the stakes have rarely been higher, and with fan anticipation levels looking set to hit a real peak over the next coming weeks, only time will tell who will be able to feed off this energy to a greater extent. It's Islam Makhachev versus Alexander Volkanovski for all the marbles, the UFC lightweight title on the line, the pound-for-pound #1 spot up for grabs, and a legacy-defining opportunity at stake. This is peak mixed martial arts, ladies and gentlemen. All that's left to do now is wait for February 12th to come around.